Today's lesson is really focusing on teaching you ways to ask effective questions to collect the data that you want. And so this is kind of that concept of taking what would be a conversation between two people and making it more purposeful and intentional. And how we ask the questions allows us to accomplish those goals. And it's something that takes practice, but once you start to learn the concepts and practice them more, you will actually find yourself using them more often than not in your own everyday life. I find myself doing this sometimes on my husband or my kids, or if I ask a question that I normally wouldn't ask in a therapeutic setting, I'll be like, oh my gosh, why did I ask it like that? But then realizing that they're not my clients, they're my family. But it does kind of help you become a better listener and a more effective conversationalist. So just some general guidelines for asking questions. I'm going to kind of break them down into a bunch of do not ask these types of questions and do ask these and be more specific. But in general, you don't want to ask why questions. We'll talk about that after I get off this slide. Generally because why questions can put a client on the defense. They might not, it's all about how you ask it. But in the kind of the rule of thumb is asking the who, what, where, why, or who, what, where, when, but not the why question. You do not want to ask too many questions at once. So we call those loaded questions. So I kind of referenced this in class the other day with that country song when he's like, what's your name? What's your age? What's your number? Where you come from? What you doing later? It doesn't give the client a chance to answer any questions, and they don't know which one to prioritize. And so we want to make sure that we are reducing it to one at a time. And we don't want to allow people to speak in generalities. So that basically means if you ask a question and they're kind of vague, it's getting you some information, but it's not necessarily getting you all the data you want to collect. So you want to make sure that you ask questions that allow for room for discussion, but also knowing that you can ask clarifying questions to kind of get more specifics on a general statement they may have made. So that does bring us to the do. So ask how or what questions, and I'll teach you how to ask those in very purposeful ways. Asking just one question at a time, keeping the question and statement ratio to about 1 to 3. So for every 3 questions, you might be able then to make a statement or reflection based on what they say. So you don't want to ask question over question over question with no bringing you back together. But you also don't want to be talking so much that you're not asking any questions. So the 1 to 3 question statement ratio is kind of what you want to aim for, 3 questions to 1 statement. And you can ask questions to clarify specifics. So I don't know, sometimes in class, if when I throw out a question and somebody answers it and it's a little bit vague, I often will be like, help me flesh that out a little bit more. So it forces, in that case, the student to kind of really reflect on what they're trying to say, and it helps then the class to have a better understanding of their answer. In the same sense, it helps the client kind of be able to have if they're talking in generalities, maybe they're avoiding a topic, or maybe they haven't thought about it deeper, having clarifying questions pushes them to go that next step into kind of exploring what they're trying to say or what they're feeling. All right, so here's the fun, some more guidelines. Like I said down here, 3 questions to 1 reflection statement. Asking questions that cannot be answered with just a simple yes or no or a very simple fact. We call those closed-ended questions. So saying, do you like summer? The answer is often yes or no. But if you're asking, what is your favorite season? Oh, it's summer. Well, tell me more about that. Has a different vibe than just asking a yes or no question. Make sure you're asking questions that are staying on topic. It helps your client focus. It helps you focus. It helps get you to those very measurable goals that we want to get to for interventions. Asking what questions, those are frequently fact-oriented. So that's really good for some of those objective, concrete things you're trying to figure out. How questions are frequently people-oriented. And so it's looking, a lot of times it'll be like, how do you feel? How did you get there? And so if it's very close to what, but how questions do start to get into some more of the like subjective data collection. Could and can questions provided the greatest flexibility in response. So I often like to ask, could you help me understand what you mean by that? Or can you explain that more? Now, technically, that's a closed-ended question because they could just say no. Sometimes I drop those, but it does kind of help take questioning to the next level. And then why questions are often provoke defensive feelings and are not advised. And we'll talk about that in this slide right here. So why should we not ask why questions? Did you see what I did there? Why questions can often sound problematic or be problematic because they sound a little bit judgmental, which they often are actually judgmental questions. So why did you do that? Why do you feel that way? Doesn't really invoke that warm and inviting conversation. It's a little bit more aggressive and can put people on the defense because if you're questioning why they felt that way or why did that, it often feels like you are being not disowning, talking down and dismissing or not really validating what they're feeling or what they did. And so that can really make a client close off. And often there's complex reasons why people do what they do. And so asking why, you can't necessarily answer the one simple reason. It might be influenced by a lot of different things. So childhood experiences, their current functioning and motivation. Maybe they were impulsive or they were expecting something in return. And the client might not be able to narrow it down to one specific reason. And then that kind of, on the flip side is if they answer in one specific way, but there's other reasons why it occurred or why they did what they did, it kind of locks them into talking about the specific reason they identified. And that can then limit your data collection or make a client feel like they are not heard. And why questions present respondents with a challenge. They either have to defend their action or explain it to you, where maybe they don't want to, or maybe they don't really fully know how to. And it does kind of create a little bit of a power dynamic that they owe something to explain or defend what they did. So part of it is in how you express the question, because the next slide will show, is it ever okay to use a why question? And it is. I've used why questions. In the back of my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to be doing this. But it's sometimes about the way you express it or how you phrase it that kind of exudes a little bit more empathy or a desire to actually understand why they, in fact, are feeling the way they feel. So that, thinking back to the nonverbals, that's the paralinguistic nonverbals, about the pitch, the communication, the tone. So adding the little bit of the statement, can you help me understand why you did that, can kind of soften the expression of it. So the example on here says, instead of saying, why did you eat that cookie? Well, it sounds like you're judging. Can you help me understand why you ate that cookie? It still is answering the same question. And again, it kind of invites a possible, if your client's being snarky, no, I can't help you understand. Okay, then you have lots of other stuff to deal with. But adding that phrase in there kind of softens it, and it invites a conversation of like, I want to understand why you did this versus I'm judging you for doing what you did. Thinking back to the client who showed me the inappropriate picture, I literally did that. I said, help me understand why you thought that was important for me to see. Instead of being like, why on God's green earth did you think that was necessary? Phrasing it in a different way, still using a why question, invited in a conversation, whether it was the most bizarre conversation or not. It allowed us to continue in and took down the judgment level just a little bit. And also asking why questions and adding like a disclaimer so they can help me understand or what are some reasons. It does help them explore various reasons why they did what they did and their motivation. And so that example of like, what are some reasons, showing that it was plural, helps clients kind of build an understanding that sometimes their motivation is multi-level. All right, so those are why questions. So avoid them at all possible, but if you do use them, make sure you're being very aware of how you're phrasing them, the tone, and then supplementing them with a statement ahead saying, can you help me understand, or what are some reasons why you might feel that way, or why you did what you did. Closed-ended questions. So these are the questions that are very focused and can usually be answered with a word or two, after which the client usually then starts talking and waits for the next question from the clinician. So this is very uncomfortable and awkward. So if you're asking a question of like, did you like school today? Like thinking about when you ask, like I've asked my kids, like, how was school today? Good. Okay, it's not inviting them into telling me more, and there's this awkward silence. And unless you have a very chatty client or a client who likes to jump in and rescue from uncomfortable pauses, typically it ends there. Then you have to come up with another question, and it's very uncomfortable. So close-ended questions often begin with the interrogatives. Why can't I say this word today? Such as do you, are you, have you? And it can hint at what the interviewer expects the response to be. So if I asked, do you like pina coladas? I'm going to expect you to say yes or no. I'm not necessarily expecting, oh yes, I really love this, this, and this, and this, and this. You're kind of expecting a yes or no answer. So the client is going to probably think in those terms as well. And a closed question is usually narrow in focus and demands facts versus a deeper explanation of motivation. So on the flip side with that is an open-ended question. So how are those different? Open-ended questions usually give the client more opportunities or flexibility to respond and elaborate on their thinking. It's keeping the client in the driver's seat of the conversation because it takes a lot of responsibility off the clinician or therapist to kind of drive to have to come up with questions or to think of what to ask next. It's allowing the client to talk more freely, and then you can start pulling bits and pieces to reflect on later. Open-ended questions usually start with the what or how, but that doesn't mean they have to be. So instead of asking, do you like pina coladas? You might ask, well, what type of beverages do you like? And they then might respond with pina coladas, but they might say something completely different. Milk, water, Mountain Dew. They might say nothing alcoholic. Okay, then you could talk about maybe why they choose not to drink. So that's going to open up a conversation much more quickly than just saying, do you like pina coladas? And if you go back to the example I said about asking your kids, how was school today? Good. Instead, I will say, tell me about school. And so that puts the pressure on. They still might say something like, it's fine, and not elaborate, but it's inviting in that conversation versus just kind of ending right there. So here's a good comparison between closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. So if I'm talking about the housing situation, well, do you live alone? Yes or no, basically is what it's the typical answer. An open-ended question is, what's your living situation? Oh, I live with my mom and my grandpa, blah, 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 blah. Did that make you sad? You're assuming that might be the emotion associated with something. Instead, asking, how did you feel about that, allows the client the opportunity to identify the emotion instead of you assuming and them having to answer yes or no. Did you hit them back? Instead, try asking, well, what did you do then? What happened then? What was your response? And that's going to invite, again, a conversation. They're going to have to identify what they did versus you kind of making the identification for them. It allows them to give the explanation from their perception, and then you can kind of reflect things back and use the content that they've shared by asking some follow-up questions after that. All right, those are closed and open questions. Part 1 on how to ask questions, and we'll go into part 2 following this.